just go ahead and start. Hola, buenos días. Okay. Yeah, so obviously my presentation title has changed. It's like a talking point. So originally I got here to do a campaign. I'm going to talk about like road bumps I encountered while being here. But my title changed to Los derechos de personas en situación de discapacidad y formación de autogestores. And so that is, I was focused on looking at the rights of people with disabilities. In Spanish, they say personas en situación de discapacidad, which I'm going to illustrate why later. I did a self-advocacy-based intervention. So, project phases. First, I had the literature review that I was doing for the first couple of months that I was here, trying to get the project off the ground, see other sources of financing for the campaign, and kind of like measure the interest in trying to build a sustainable project around that. So that was that phase. Next, I did a development of materials, which is a little bit different. I used a participatory-based methodology. So I had to do a lot of interaction with people with disabilities to formulate my research materials because they were my target population. So I had to work with various individuals with psychological and intellectual disabilities to develop my surveys, my focus group questions, and my interview questions. The third portion of my project was implementation. And then lastly, I'm currently still in the intervention stage. So, literature review. So from March until May, I was really concentrated on trying to make the campaign take off the ground. So I don't know if you guys necessarily remember. Originally I came and I really wanted to do a campaign with people with disabilities to try to combat stigma. And so I was really focused on that and organizing different groups and trying to meet with different organizations. And sadly, things kind of didn't necessarily pan out very well in that sense. I was doing a literature review, and I was focusing on, I had some delays because a lot of the results weren't necessarily published on time. So when I got here, Chile had just conducted a new survey on disability. It was a new national survey, and they had started publishing the results in PowerPoint presentations with very few points in February, and they're still putting the results out to this day. So you can access it and go into Stata and try to evaluate it yourself, but it's a lot nicer when you don't have to go through 300 questions and figure out what information you want to pull from or extract from a census. The last week of March as well, Chile had an exam in Switzerland in front of the Commission on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was a huge basis of my study because I was focusing on the International Convention from the United Nations. So they actually had their exam this year, and they had to go and present what they've done since ratifying the convention. But that wasn't until March, and so I had to transcribe afterwards the interviews. And then also, like, I hit another road bump with my literature review because the commission was supposed to, there was an accessory committee to the president dedicated to disabilities, and they were supposed to publish the report in March, and they didn't publish it until like May. And so it was a 2-year analysis of what public policy problems there are in Chile and what steps forward they need to do to resolve the situation for persons with disabilities. So that was my literature review. It got delayed, and I'm still starting to analyze and delve into these things just because my project was extremely time sensitive. But road bumps. So my project was obviously really time sensitive. I hit not a wall, I don't want to say. I got to the point where in my project, I wasn't seeing that if I did the campaign, I had achieved interest in financing in a sense that I had to like apply for it. But I didn't necessarily see it sustaining into the future. Someone actually taking an active role in implementing it every year or continuing with it into the future. So I decided because it wasn't going to be sustainable, it wasn't necessarily a good idea. To combat stigma or discrimination, I think it's a repeated process. And I realized that after Christmas break, no one was really necessarily going to take the reins and keep going with it. So I set that aside and I decided to work specifically just with people with disabilities and empowering them. So I was doing the diagnostic analysis on with the literature review and what rights were available to people with disabilities and what public policy programs public policy problems exist in Chile. And then I decided to focus just on training. Because when I was doing my implementation of my surveys, I started to realize that people have no idea what's going on. And so to really make sure that they understand their rights before getting that, I really wanted to ensure that they understood their rights before getting and participating in a campaign against stigma, I think they need to know what stigma is, discrimination is, and what their rights are, and what the convention is. So I decided to focus on that. Development of materials, methodology. So I used a participatory research model. It wasn't necessarily completely participatory because of time constraints. So doing a participatory research process takes a lot of time because it's a lot of feedback, and it's a lot of give and take. And it's also a lot of conducting the research with people with disabilities. And so it was using their input, but not necessarily like they were the researchers. With the intervention, we're doing more of that, but with this portion, it was more of just getting their feedback. So it's about conducting research with others. People labeled with learning difficulties have the right to be included in research concerning themselves, which I think is a really important point. Oftentimes they're just recipients of information and recipients of services, and that doesn't necessarily help them to empower and be an active participant in the shaping of their future. And it comes out a lot in my research. People don't know what they like. People don't know what they want to do. People haven't been asked to do something necessarily at a higher level before. And yeah, so inclusive methodologies and accessible resources are really important. And so for that portion, it's really key to work with people with disabilities because they're obviously the experts of materials being accessible to them. And yeah, those are just a few quotes. I'll run through them. But this is something that I developed. So I had to take my consent form that I made for the organizations and anybody that was a worker at an organization that wanted to participate in my research study. This was the version of the consent form for them, and this is the first page of the consent form for people with disabilities. So this is an easy read format. And it's really hard to do the formatting. And it's interesting because what I would do is then I would sit down with someone and I'd be like, okay, do these images help you to understand this? And this is actually a novel concept in Chile, so a lot of people take my research materials and duplicate them. But I sat down with multiple people with disabilities to discuss the language, keywords used if we needed to explain certain concepts. For example, anonymous, the word anonymous, what does it mean? So we put a person and it's like a secret, and so that helps people start to internalize the information better. Pictures are normally a sense of reaffirmation. So that's one thing that I had to do. So this is accessible format example. So implementation, after I had formulated all of those materials with them, in June I finally started to begin to implement the informed consent and interviews so I could then go into focus groups. So I got 5 organizations on board, and so I'm working with 2 versions of Rostros Nuevos, which is an organization for people with psychological disabilities, and I'm working with 2 programs, one in Santiago and one in Valparaiso for people that are homeless. And then I'm working with Goenil. I don't know if you guys have seen Goenil. They're at the national level of Chile, but I'm working specifically with one of their work formation locations. And then I'm working with Best Buddies in Chile. That's an American organization started by the Kennedys. And then Líderes con Mil Capacidades, which is really interesting because they're the example of self-advocacy here in Chile. But it's really interesting when you start to ask people what they know about self-advocacy, what formation they've actually gotten. So I used a model more based in the United States, Australia, and Canada, which is much more based on formation, conferences, capacitations, and trainings, I should say. Sorry, I'm speaking in Spanglish. So it's much more based on actually making sure that people understand the information that's being fed to them. So yeah. This is an example of my survey. So my survey was it was pretty long in total because we wanted to gather a lot of demographic information, but I ran into road bumps with that as well because, so for example, in Chile, there's a status called interdiction, and interdiction literally revokes in Chile all of your legal rights. So you are no longer viewed as a citizen of Chile. You're viewed underneath someone else. It's extremely invasive, extremely problematic, especially with people with mental disabilities. And also the Civil Code says that if you are deaf or deaf and mute, you are automatically unable to act for yourself still. So these are policy formations that need to change. So it was really interesting. So I wanted to know how many participants were declared unable, and there are no statistics. So even organizations don't even know if they have someone that's if one of their participants is declared unable, which I think is extremely problematic, because then you don't necessarily understand like the legal implications of working with that person. So we did demographic information. I had photos to accompany each of these questions. I had to develop it with people with disabilities. And then specifically the portion that I was measuring was if they knew what a right was, if they could give me examples of rights. Moreover, if they feel like they can make their own decisions, give me examples of those decisions that they make. And then in this moment, if they feel that they can choose who to live with, where they want to live, if they want to leave, and if they can choose like who to spend their time with. And it would turn into a dialogue, which was really interesting to hear like what people would say. And then I worked with the basic principles of the convention, which is autonomy, autodetermination, dignity, independence, inclusion, accessibility, and respect for difference. And so I'd ask them if they've known these, and then to give me examples. And this brought up really interesting data that I'm going to start to analyze. But for example, like dignity, I worked with a lady with that specifically responded, yes, I know what dignity is. I was deprived and violated of all of my human dignity in one of the centers here, or one of the hospitals here. That's a psychiatric ward. And so it's interesting to hear their stories and like what they associate with these words. And it's really interesting to hear people say like they know these words and they don't know how to define them, which I think is really problematic. It's just not taking time to give information of quality. And so then the last two questions were if they knew about the convention, if they could give examples of rights, and then moreover, if they knew that the convention, this is super technical, is supraconstitucional, but it's because in the exam, Chile said multiple times to the committee that it's super constitutional, we treat it like it's super constitutional, and even legal like lawyers and like people that work within lawmaking in Chile recognize that it's not treated as such. And then if they know if they knew any policies or norms in Chile for people with disabilities. So that's my survey. And I implemented it with over 80 people with disabilities, so this takes like 20 minutes or like to an hour with each person, depending on like how much they want to talk. But it was a really interesting fieldwork portion. So intervention. So basically after implementing my surveys, doing focus groups with people to talk more in depth about what their experiences were with rights, I decided to formulate a self-advocacy-based intervention based on that, and talk to them really about what rights were and try to break down the information for them. So of course, I was really ambitious with my intervention, so I planned like multiple phases and methodology and like had many goals. But at the end of the day, I decided to cater it to what they needed. So it changes every week. But I began to realize that the participation of people with disabilities in Chile was symbolic rather than active participation, and that people with disabilities lacked the comprehension and the accompaniment necessary to be able to actually engage in the formation of public policies. And Chile actually has a law that states that you need to work with people with disabilities to formulate policies that affect them, but how are they going to work with you if they don't know what's going on? So I formulated the intervention based on the concept of self-advocacy in Chile, in the United States, Canada, and Australia, which focuses on people fighting for their own desires, making their own decisions, having their voice reflected in the decisions that affect them, asking for help when it's necessary, which is really key because a lot of people think that if you have independence and you're autonomous, you can't ask for help. So we had to work a lot on that concept, and people that defend their rights. And the last one was actually developed by a participant, and it's doing a type of monitoring. That changed the implement. Yeah, so this is the diploma. I went into it thinking I was going to work with each group for 2 hours, and that got up to 4. So I work with 5 groups for 4 hours a week. I start on Wednesdays and I finish on Fridays. And it's really interesting. It's really fun. And then I work with the Universidad Católica to implement the diploma, and they're getting all certified in a couple of weeks. And then this is the model I developed. This is autonomy, communication, this is self-awareness, communication, autonomy, empowerment, autodetermination, which is like being goal-oriented, and then fighting and defending others. So every week we're supposed to develop one of these, which didn't necessarily turn out as such, but we're working on it. But just to kind of give you guys a background of what I do to break down the information to them. So what a disability is based off of, or how it's measured on a global scale, the World Health Organization has developed a CEF, which is a classification of functioning, that measures, oh no, it jumped. Okay. Yeah, so it measures disability, And it defines it as an interaction between a condition, a health condition. It's jumping. Yeah. So, sorry, this one was a really interactive one. I think it was overly ambitious to shoot it or to send it by email. So the SEEF basically isn't this. This is what we developed it into. So the SEEF measures, one, your condition, your health condition. So it looks at like what is your health condition specifically, what does it imply, what are your symptoms, what medicines do you need. But then there's another portion of it which is called functioning. So how does that, or it's called performance. How does that person perform in their environment? So it looks at like what supports they have. It looks at what like education. It's more of like a socially based evaluation. And it's really interesting because what you end up seeing is with the definition that we developed and how I broke it down for them, is we turned it into a condition of health and life. So, because it's defined as something that is of largo plazo, and something of larger duration. It's not necessarily a condition that is just for a short amount of time, and the SEEF only measures like the condition in that moment. So we combined the SEEF and the CRPD, and we developed this one to define a disability. So types of difficulties, you have people with physical disabilities, sensorial disabilities, intellectual, and psychological. But we decided that the environment should be based off of attitudes, accessibility, help, and structural barriers. And so what the SEEF allowed us to do was transform and show like that there's two portions of a disability. So it's more than just the condition that the person has. And so there's an example that I developed with one of my tables. And they wanted to talk about a person that has a health condition. So they have schizophrenia and they have depression. Yeah, so it's this person, health condition, neutral. But when this person interacts with society, they're told that they're sick. They're told that so they're told that they're sick. Oh, this is actually what we developed. Sorry, I thought this was a different one. This is actually what we developed to present to the Ministry of Health. And so this was a woman that had been interned. And so when she was forcibly interned, she was just given pills and injected. So she would go to sleep and she would wake up and there'd be syringes and there'd be people taking her blood against her consent, and she never knew what was going on, and she'd be asleep like the whole entire time. And so she was talking about her experience and how those are like attitudes. So it's like treating someone like less than human. Accessibility. So, for example, this woman, she went to the doctor this month, and the doctor shut the door on her face. And the nurse shut the door on her face, and her doctor didn't even show up. So obviously, health isn't accessible to that person with a disability. And help. So help while they're attaining services. So the doctors don't have time or patience with them. And they don't have psychologists on site that can help somebody understand like what their condition and what necessarily the treatment while they're interned or even like undergoing treatment on a day-to-day basis implies. And structural policies like the one that I mentioned that allows the substitution of consent. And so as you guys can tell, this generates a situation of a disability because a person without these things, so a person that is treated like a subject of rights, a person that has access to the health system, and a person that has access to the sufficient supports and has policies in place that support their decision making, generates a lesser form of a disability. And that's why the model now is to talk about a situation of a disability because, I won't go back. But that's why the model now is to talk about a situation of a disability, because it's a person with the same exact condition. So you have this person that their health condition didn't change, but their supports did. And this person is able to function in the environment at a much higher rate than somebody that has more barriers and encounters more problems. And so this is like how I break down the information with them and what we talk about, and it generates interesting debates. So the groups I'm working, they're the only ones that decided to have a name, but these are the people from Goinil. Specifically, each group has a project that they're developing to try to like have them be proactive and engage with their rights. So they're doing right now a video against bullying, an anti-bullying video, and so they talk about their bullying experiences and what they had in school. I'm working with a group of people that want to develop a book about how they got to their own situation. Here they say situación de calle, how they became homeless, what being homeless implies, which is really heavy because they talk about how they used to fight in the streets for certain things, and they recognize the indignities that they had to face. And then I work actually in the Fulbright office, thank you, on Thursdays with a group that's doing discrimination in the workplace. And specifically, they wanted to see if other people felt discriminated against in the workplace and not just focus on people with disabilities. So they're doing a video. And then the other two groups, one is doing an evaluation of accessibility. So they're doing it specifically in the Quinta Región. And then the other one is wanting to develop better rights associated with a disability card. So yeah, so I'm in that right now. Next steps. So I need to finish this project. We're going to have two conversatorios. They're coming up next week, they're coming up the 6th and the 12th of December. And so I'm just getting all the materials compiled for that. It's definitely a pilot. And it was really interesting because we're trying to open up the debate to see how these organizations can continue to work. So a lot of self-advocacy organizations are normally linked to a university. And in Chile, there aren't many universities that are looking to do studies with people with disabilities, and the ones that do aren't working with people with disabilities. So we're trying to figure out how we can link the two and make more of an institute that works specifically with people with disabilities. So analysis. So I haven't had, because I had to work with 5 groups for 4 hours each week, I have not had time to analyze the information. So the next step is analysis of my field work and the exam videos, because we're trying to compile a secondary report on what was said during the exam, because we want to have a type of efficient monitoring. Or I do. And publications. We want to do one about awareness of rights. I want to do one about how people with disabilities feel about their rights, which is much more of a qualitative analysis, about the methodology that I use because it's new in Chile, and the results of the intervention, so like what's been going on through the working groups. And then, I applied for a master's in public policy to try to continue to help Chile work from a public policy standpoint and have people with disabilities participate in the formation of a public policy on mental capacity that respects the rights of people with disabilities. And I just want to say thank you. Sorry you guys had to sit through so much information. I hope it wasn't too dry. I want to say thank you to Fulbright for allowing me to use this awesome conference room, and also for your support to the university, because they've been very generous with me in supporting my project in multiple ways. To the observatory I'm currently working with on the rights of persons with disabilities. It's been a fun ride helping them to further develop. They were actually one of my sponsors, and they were going to take over the campaign, but they had some internal conflicts when I left. And thank you to Daniel for allowing me to use your apartment 4 times a week, because I had to live in Valpo sometimes. So thank you guys.
I think we have time for, one question.
Yeah, sorry, that was a lot of information.
Hi, Alex.
Yes.
You mentioned that you mentioned that people here don't expect them to participate in these studies. Do you think the expectation that they're not going to say do things correctly or meet expectations, do you think that limits kind of how much influence they can have, or sort of their ability to overcome any discapacities that they might have?
Yeah, well, participatory research studies normally last more than a year, because what it ends up doing is, the researchers, for example, take a couple months to do analysis, and then they get the feedback of the people with disabilities. So, for example, what I'm doing with their projects is I bring their projects to them, and I implement the changes that they want to see. So it's much more of a proactive accompaniment. I think, though, in Chile, it's not necessarily the fear of them not being able to do the research, it's more of just not knowing. So what I've realized is they haven't necessarily studied other models here, and there's very successful examples of participatory research, and it just depends necessarily how you want to engage people. So if you work with someone with a lesser form of an intellectual disability, there's no problem, but you have to think of creative ways of trying to engage them and ensure that they're understanding the information that you're trying to obtain. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a fear of them not necessarily being able to participate. I just don't think people have taken the time to try to develop the materials.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And now to change the tone a little bit,
Yeah.
Want to take over you?
Oh no.
Well, I'm gonna put my phone away because I don't want to like throw it in there. Whoever's person is. Is that your person?
Yes.
All right, whatever. So it's no secret. I'm a poet. Poetry is no methodology, just results. And I didn't practice any of this. So you got nothing prepared. Prepare for nothing. Just kidding. I've got like 7 or 8 poems to read, and I think that it's gonna be fun. And I'm really happy that I have a printout, because to be reading it, looking at this, for me, I don't know, it would suck. I don't know. I guess I'll wait till everybody gets on. So the first poem I'm gonna read. It's called "Ode to Doorknobs." I did like Pablo Neruda. He did like a whole book of Odas Elementales. You know, he does like Ode to Onions, Ode to Soup, Ode to a ton of random stuff. And so, but I wanted to do stuff like that, but with like I called them like industrial odes, right? So I did like Ode to Doorknobs, Ode to Credit Cards, Microwaves. I spent a lot of time thinking about microwaves. I don't know why. Oh wow. Whatever size you want. All right, cool. So first one is Ode to Doorknobs. Crack and rattle go crowds of concrete jungles, jostling open with the force of curled copper and brass, mummies of controlled embers whose utility of negative hand shapes is discovered in an ice age contained in a room. You are a wrist daydream, a woman who worries she'll never be touched again, like a love letter tied around a pigeon's ankle. You protect samples of secret cures by refusing to budge. Ocean boulder, tiny sun trapped in the light, it pours over our heads like pots of burning oil on the sidewalk at the drain's request. Forget your past of melted metal. Forget the smeared sweat, the scent of private parts. The rattlesnake of loose screws lives in your lean wood, curling into itself for a craving of its own tail, yanked by yearning for the cleaning cleave of wind as you, alloyed security guard, let yourself become a negative space for fear of losing the privilege that makes you the envy of the walls. Yeah.
That was good.
Thanks. Okay, so this next poem's called Why Shave My Beard. So I used to have a beard, right, for like 3-4 years. Looked like Brian. My sister called me Drake. I guess I kind of looked like him. Without it, apparently I look like Daddy Yankee. But anyway, I was thinking about, like, you know how beards are really popular now? Everyone's got them and everyone looks really cool with them, like all of you guys. Like, you know, I don't know, like after I shaved it, I tried to grow back and it got really scratchy. And then I was thinking about that while sitting at a cafe, and I wrote this poem. It's because it's fun. It makes me laugh because, you know, some of you guys have asked me like what my day-to-day life was like, and really, I was a full-time poet, and so you can imagine, like, if you're following me on Snapchat, you know, like I watched a lot of Family Guy, and I walked around like taking pictures of street art a lot. Actually, that doesn't have to do with this poem though, so I'll just read it. Why I Shave My Beard. When I learned that all I needed to look smart was a beard, I wanted to look stupid. I wanted to look stupid as a pigeon crossing the street to peck the concrete for worms. I dragged the razor across my bumpy neck like a mop along a floor that hadn't been swept. And when I thought that all it took to be handsome was hair, I shaved my entire head. I shaved my entire head and found a blowhole. Then, I poked my brain with 2 fingers how a teenager swipes a frosting flower off the closest curve of a cake's ringed garden. Tracing the grooves of my gray matter, I came across something that didn't belong, and I was more nervous than a spoonful of instant coffee as boiling water belly flops to burn it, as if an entire lake leapt from the bay into my mouth. I tried to pull it out like a plug deep behind the TV, but I felt something unstick, something rip, and in my palm appeared a taut tangle of unfilled balloons. Okay, man, this is the most Chilean of the things that I did. And I wrote, so 21 de Mayo, right? I have a little epigraph say, this day commemorates the Chilean Navy for a battle they lost against Peru. President addresses the country from the Congressional Building in Valparaiso inciting protests. And I don't know if you guys know, on that day, some of you have been to my apartment, like I was having a silo on my roof, and they burned an entire apartment. And this like with these protests, and there was a guy that was trapped in there, unfortunately, and died. And then like it was burning for like 6 or 7 hours, this apartment, and underneath it there was a Farmacia Uma that closed down, and I mean for days like you could smell it all throughout like Valparaiso. It was really really powerful to be walking around that. And then also that same day, which I mentioned in the poem, they killed 2 lions at the zoo in Santiago. If you guys hear about that, like the way I present it in the poem is not surreal or anything. It's exactly what happened. In a poem, as much real as a poem can be. Anyway, 21 de Mayo. They scorched an apartment in Valparaiso. Protesters, picket signs, spray paint, white lines crossed by green policemen with steel shields, nightsticks, and helmets pushing through livid mobs like a tsunami bursting through a skyscraper's windows. Smoke monuments erected from charred Chilean flags, spooling from melted driftwood. One body everyone waited to see leap to the asphalt from a fire window. They scorched an apartment in Valparaiso. Meanwhile, from a wooden podium with a small microphone she had to adjust, the president unleashed the budget like a water balloon 20 stories onto a stranger's head. Meanwhile, at the Santiago Zoo, a naked man with a suicide note in his discarded clothes juked security to enter the lion cage. And because they had no tranquilizers, they shot 2 lions he provoked to save him from being mauled to death. They scorched an apartment in Valparaiso, closing the pharmacy below, a museum of Tylenol, birth control, hairspray, jugs of protein burned behind now boarded windows, pharmacists and security guards walking to the library for free Wi-Fi to check job listings in Viña del Mar. They scorched an apartment in Valparaiso. Still you can smell the embers as you walk to the Italian cathedral full of angel statues, the graffiti-graced supermarket, up Cerro Bellavista to Neruda's house, now a museum, and past the trees on the other end of Plaza Victoria. They scorched an apartment in Valparaiso. It reeks of paper money shrieking from the inside of a searing ATM. Okay, so this is like a big emotional turn from that kind of heavy-handed poem. So the story of this poem is that you guys know I have a lot of energy and I tend to like knock out at like 10 p.m., right? Not if I drink Cuban coffee at 9 p.m. And so I woke up at 1 a.m. and I was watching a movie, like streaming it illegally, whatever. And you know how when you do that, there's clickbait, like all these articles? Well, one of them was called, Men, How to Look Young After You Turn 50. And it made me laugh so hard, like I immediately wrote a poem about it. And I had all this energy from the Cuban coffee, so like, I don't know. I had a really fun time writing this poem, to be honest. All right. Men, how to look young after you turn 50. Sharpie all of your hairs black. Grow them as long as possible. Meditate 10 minutes a day, reciting the mantra, smooth skin, smooth skin. Coat your bathtub in lotion. Use baby shampoo. Practice standing up from your chair without using your throat. Go for morning walks. Exfoliate. That means scrub your face so viciously your dead skin falls into the drain like a pet fish. Sport a leather jacket and police officer sunglasses at the mall. Kiss your wife in public, slipping a hand into her back pocket. Make people uncomfortable. Flex your biceps so they pop out of your too tight V-neck like a lollipop in a candy bowl. To avoid wrinkled brows, watch TV instead of reading. To avoid a sagging T-zone, smile every other week only and laugh on either your birthday or Christmas. It's better to be angry because your face will exercise more muscles, keeping its tightness intact. Don't believe the hype about cucumbers. The trend now is pickles. 8 hours to sleep is too many. There's nothing beautiful about losing a third of your life when you're trying to eliminate a third of your life. Abide by these rules, and in no time at all, you will be good as new. There's not really anybody here over 50, I don't think.
Yeah.
Don't lie.
Use cucumber.
Trend is pickles.
The trend now is pickles, so you're gonna have to change it up. So like this poem, this next one's called Tchaikovsky, after the composer, really good piano concertos and all that stuff. And sometimes in the morning, the myth is that I only listen to rap music, but the reality is that I wake up and I put on Tchaikovsky a lot and like other types of music. And I was just really excited one morning, and I was listening to him, and so I wrote a poem about it, about being excited. Anyway, all right, Tchaikovsky. I'm sexy to strangers and more angry than tea bags. Barred windows, weighty doors. I appreciate your efforts, the way a graffitied building reminisces about white bird shit and accepts the square tongues of paint rollers. But my legs are light as unused cannons, and my mom will soon call to divulge the inner workings of my bucktooth rival, solitude. My head was full of frozen steam like a stalactite, but my ears, now clean and clear, unlocked the maraca rattle of stolen amulets sitting in a vapid Sprite can. Today, the laundromat's earthquake only convinces me further of my immortality, like a zooming hand slicing in and out of a fan's tornado without being panged. I like to imagine the soul is what my heart decides to see when she winks at himself in a building's tinted windows. Old burn backs of pondering, wet forehead positioned at the sun like an impatient telescope. You'll say I'm a superhero, and my kryptonite is Cuban coffee and a long intestine of imported chorizo. My strength is sprinting so blazingly fast, you don't realize I'm scrawny, like a doctor's office in a strip mall. Spartans, in the roll the credits of their Bildungsromans, uprooted trees by pushing against them all night with their burly backs, their boulder shoulders, calves of Mentos mixed with Diet Coke. But Americans know better, name the dream after themselves, to abolish the omnipotent werewolf, choosing to be tamed for the love of hamburgers and dulce de leche ice cream. Every time I try to evolve into a better person, I feel held back and inadequate, like a car so self-conscious it squeaks down the avenue. And when someone tells me to behave like an adult, I wonder, what do you want me to do? Wear black dress socks with my sneakers? I'd rather mold myself in someone strong enough to bend glass into a ball without a blowtorch. Because marbles are the daughters of diamonds. Diamonds, which we're told are rare but can be carved out of most mountains. Mountains, obese, but moved an inch yearly by ants and sharpened by a wind so authentic we can hear it in a toddler's grocery store shriek, the struck matchbox of impending divorce. The word love played on an old piano by lustful fingers rousing the keys to unleash a choir of captive doves. I didn't write this poem in Chile. I wrote this poem like 2 years ago in Costa Rica, but I got it published while I was here, and I was really happy because, well, it's not published yet. I got accepted for publication, and it's going to be published in a journal I really like, and I kind of like this poem a lot. And also, I want to talk about that for a second, about the idea of publication, because realistically, poets like generally get like 1% of everything they do published, right? So I've got like 10, 12, 15 publications or something. I've written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of poems, you know? And I just think like, I don't know, maybe something everyone could learn from that is just like, don't try to publish. No, but like, you know, I do this because it gives me joy, you know? It makes me feel really like good, and it gets to be expressive, and just like, I don't know, I just want to say like, find joy in your work, even if you don't get published, you know? Like, most of these poems weren't published, except this one. But I like reading them, and I like you guys. All right, cool. The art on the back of the map. The mountains where you live have been filled with fruits, pineapples stained by strawberries, and I must save you from the mosquitoes passing through the surrounding jungle. Otherwise, what good would I be as the king of ants in your garden? Forget it. I'm going to peel the sheets of grass off the earth's scalp. I want to measure the dirt's thickness. I'm going to Venice, or Spain, or to your house to show you the glass jar I made for us in the king-size bed I put inside, and the giant dog that guards it, if you're into it. I know I am because I know what I like. Because between the cavemen who didn't understand why their teeth hurt so much, and the world where every house is a historical monument where someone famous grew up, there's the beer bottle about to shatter on our heads if we don't move. There's you and me and a paper airplane made of money we don't have yet. So here's to the rolling bowling ball down your grassy mountain, to the archer and his arrows, the sun and his sun. And here's to the flat moon rolling around the earth like a coin on a table, our rope tied to it, and you on my back, looking at the map like Columbus, so certain there's another side. Yeah, all right, man. This poem took me so long to write because I don't know if any of you guys have ever felt like you're not good enough to do something, or I don't know, maybe some days you don't love yourself as much as other days, you know? Well, many poets that I really like, there's a guy named Roger Reeves who's dope. He lives in Chicago, really cool. Frank O'Hara, my all-time favorite poet. If you hang out with me for more than a day, I'll read you like all his poems. P.S. He had a really great line I read the other day. He says, "What you don't know will hurt someone else." How cool is that? That's a good line. And then like this other poet named Ocean Vuong, who's really incredible. He published a poem in the New Yorker called "Someday I'll Love Ocean Vuong," and I read it and it's so good, this poem, right? But I was thinking, man, like, what about today, Ocean? You know? But it's kind of cool because when you read it, it's like everyone's Ocean Vuong, and so hopefully you all can be Daniel Eduardo Ruiz, or like your own way of it, you know? But it's kind of an homage to those people that I really like, these like really influential poets to me. So today I love Daniel Eduardo Ruiz, after many dope poets that came before me. All right. Today I love Daniel Eduardo Ruiz, short angel on the basketball court who still can't dunk, having shredded 5 tentacles in one knee, popped both bubble-wrapped feet, rolled his ankle like homemade croissants, and displaced his shoulders monolith. Oh, Daniel, when I think you'll never write another good line, you wake up at 4 a.m. and zoom to the living room like we're the bathroom and grab your computer like we're the TV remote, and you type until your knuckles crack like crisp pork. Just admit it. You're more sexy than manila folder with a red top secret stamp that everyone sees but won't look at, like on a first date, a tight pimple on the forehead of someone who looked better online. Daniel, if you really wish to make the world look like you see it, you must lift it off your stomach like the head of a dead dad. Love loneliness. The world can only handle you in small doses, but to be a prisoner, you must be conscious that you can't move like a rock's liquid heart. You're special, and even more so if you believe that you are powerful like a poodle tugging on a neighbor's jeans. Become a better version of yourself if you desire, but right now you should feel as whole and confident as a dryer with its white mouth open. Daniel, aren't you sick of feeling like your future self is above and not in front of you? You must learn to forgive yourself and blame others. You must accept that your hair, when you let it grow, grows into an afro, up, not down. Take more ownership of the language you use. Everyone wants to be the best in the whole world, but if you omit the word whole, maybe you could be happy with only your part in it. Truth is, whatever you believe to be true is, and it's just as okay to feel as light as an empty wallet as it is to feel as expansive as a dandelion. Daniel, you can't be the only one who spent the first 20 few years of his life not knowing that a rooster is a male chicken, or that a pickle is a tortured cucumber. Cut yourself some slack. Ignorance is only a sin if you hide behind it, and if you let the stigma of criticism affect you, you only develop astigmatism, and you're too handsome to be blurry like a 3D movie. That's why I love you today, because you know you can't not be yourself no matter how much like other people you behave, because you know imitation is not only flattery but a model for learning. Because, and it took you too long to know it, there are some things about you that are too lovely not to be given back to the world. I mean that for all of you, yo. Just give it back to the world. I don't know. Is there questions, comments, anything? Just poems, right?
I have a question too. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I was curious about the structure. Well, first of all, these are all awesome. But I was curious about how you decide on the structure, like under Tchaikovsky.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious about the way you divided up you put these spaces in the middle of sentences, but now my ears are clean. Then the next paragraph became clear. And I was curious, if there's a thought behind that. I mean, I'm sure there is a thought behind that. So I'm curious what it is.
Sometimes the cool thing about poetry is that it's written in a way where, unlike prose, which is meant to be read quickly, poetry in the way that it's broken up is meant to slow you down. So whenever, these are all very conscious decisions, right? But when you're making them, you're just like Frank O'Hara, he says, you just go on your nerve. If someone's chasing you with a knife, you just run. You don't look back and say, what did he say? Give it up. I was a track star, Mineola prep. Like, you just go, And kind of, when you're doing it, like the first draft is very much improvised in all respects, And the editing is very much the same, but kind of like when you get to the final edits, like you start to think, how can I make this poem full of surprise so it can be rereadable, and so that like it can make you think about language in a different way. So if I end the line like this and start the next stanza, it's meant to, in a sense, highlight that, like, the disjunction between what these two things are, you know, for example. Or a general rule for, like, starting poets is don't end lines on, end your lines on nouns, you know, because it looks kind of weird to end at least in my opinion, I think, like, ending a line on the word I is a little bit technically loose. And, like, I want my poems not to be loose. I want them to be very, like, tight and, you know, yeah, just very good. Frank O'Hara also, about that, Frank O'Hara says, like, I don't believe in, like, learning about all this assonance and stuff and being very conscious about it. He's like, the equation he makes is, if you buy a pair of jeans, you want them to be tight enough so that everyone will want to sleep with you, you know? And so you want your poems to be just like that, you know? I don't know.
Do you write poems in Spanish too?
Yeah, but
Is English your preferred?
yeah, like I like writing them in English better because there's just like I'm better at the wordplay in English. You know, in Spanish, I think I can come out with like really crispy images, but and really sonically is beautiful. But the challenge for me to write in English, it interests me more. I don't know.
I think we'll have to take more time to talk about this at lunch.
Yeah.
I think so. Thank you once again for Daniel. Very good talk. Next, a big treat.
What is it, Bill Dungermont? Bill Dungermont is a coming of age story. Oh God. It's a coming of age story. It's the same one. Tchaikovsky. Yeah, like The Matrix, for example, is a Bill Dungermont.
Yeah. Hi everybody. My presentation is on my project, which is thusly entitled Modern Invasion Tactics and Bumblebees and Consequences for the Local Community. I spent the past 9 months looking at invasive bumblebee, Bombus terrestris, which was introduced a couple decades ago and is displacing the native bumblebee, Bombus delbumi. And yeah, like a lot of other people's projects, some things went well and other things had to be altered. So some quick review of kind of the system and the reason why this is an important question. Pollinators are enormously important. Hymenoptera in the family of in which all the bees are kept, and the wasps and whatnot are especially so, and especially honeybees and bumblebees. And so looking at plants and pollinators is really important because pollination is an essential ecosystem service, economically hugely important around the world. People depending on it for food as well as their livelihood. But also just from a natural point of view, pollinators and the mutualisms they form with plants is very, very important from just the stability of any given ecosystem. And the big point about honeybees and bumblebees and why they are so spread around the entire world is because in our current, in modernity, we have huge scale agricultural practices with a large dependence on the movement of pollination services across international and national borders. So for example, in the US, when it comes time for the start of the growing season, there's a huge industry in transporting semi-loads of honeybees or bumblebees around the country to go pollinate the almond trees or the orange trees or blueberries or whatever. And this causes lots of different problems. It causes issues of stress on the bees, as well as a lot of introduction of these species to new places and that's what's happened here. Is that bumblebees were introduced because they are very good pollinators compared to honeybees, especially in in the northern and southern latitudes. And this is because they are very large, they're hairy, and because of this, they're also able to thermoregulate. in order to achieve flight, they have to warm up their muscles sufficiently to be able to fly, and there's the whole like thermoregulation economics that they have to work out. But honeybees, which are kind of the more popular around the world source of pollination services, are unable to do this. So bumblebees, when you get down to areas like Patagonia where you have really strong winds, a lot of precipitation, usually a lot of precipitation, they are unable to be utilized efficiently. And furthermore, there's certain plants and a lot of the crops that are important to Chile's agricultural economy necessitate buzz pollination, wherein the sacs of pollen are tightly kept, and so you need a bug that's robust enough to be able to shake the pollen loose, and bumblebees are able to do this. Going forward, something to keep in mind is that there's kind of like, you can classify bumblebees into two large groups of the long and the short tongue, which is looking at the proboscis, which affects what plants they can pollinate efficiently, and leads to a lot of coevolutionary adaptations over time in a given ecosystem. And so when you bring in a new species that wasn't evolved with certain plants, they might break mutualisms or just preferentially pollinate other invasive plants and create kind of a bad spiral for a native ecosystem. So the species of interest for me were primarily Bombus delbomi down there, which is the native bumblebee. It's the largest bumblebee in the world, and it's 2015. It was added to the IUCN's endangered species list because of two introductions of bumblebees for pollination services. So a while back, Bombus bruturatus was introduced, and that correlated with a decline in populations of the native species, but not like a terrible crash. But then when Bombus terrestris appeared in Chile and spread over into Argentina, that's when we really saw a huge reduction in the regions in which you saw Bombus delbomi, as well as the population density in locations where it persisted. And then also there's two yellow jackets that have been introduced, and they're another factor involved in things that are going on and potential consequences for the local community of plants. So one of the first things I wanted to do, or one of the first things that I was thinking about, was kind of the range expansion. Bombus delbomi, or Bombus terrestris rather, has been expanding its range at about 200 kilometers per year, based off of some estimates on presence absence over a couple years. And they were originally introduced in 1997 in central Chile, kind of this area-ish, and then spread rapidly southward and over the mountains into Argentina. And originally I thought it would be fantastic to go down to Punta Arenas, where, as far as the literature was concerned, Bombus terrestris did not exist yet. So for example, in the IUCN 2015 report, in which they decided that, or officially classified Bombus delbomi as endangered, the most up-to-date information I had was that Magallanes is the only region where Bombus terrestris had not yet arrived. And unfortunately, this was not at all the case. So upon arriving to Punta Arenas, I saw Bombus terrestris pretty much immediately, and it took a long time before I saw any delbomi. And so I was curious about, when it had occurred, because that's very important. And so I went and talked to a few different people, and there's kind of a conflicting narrative on a lot of fingers being pointed. INEA apparently did bring Bombus terrestris down to do like an in-house experiment on the effect of if fruit set was increased by Bombus terrestris on certain plants, and of course it wasn't a very well done experiment, but apparently independent farmers also heard that they were doing this and started importing bumblebees down there, because as of still there's no regulation on the import of bumblebees outside of trying to make sure that they don't have any pests or parasites, but there's no control on the importation of them, and thus they entered Magallanes and have been there for 2 or 3 years, and potentially have invaded the entire continent. So Punta Arenas is right up there. That's where I was based. This little edge here is the very, very southern tip of the continent itself. Over here is Tierra del Fuego, the Isla Grande Tierra del Fuego. And I have some collections of specimens basically as far south as the road goes, 66 kilometers south of Punta Arenas. And so, anyways, this altered very much how I was thinking about the system. I thought I'd be able to explore where the invasion front was, as well as look at Dalbomai in an as of yet uninvaded system. And this had consequences as well for how I'm thinking about modeling the system, because now I don't know for sure where the clean invasion front is. If Bombus terrestris would have already reached that far south anyways, where the new introduction has spread outwards. So looking at like specimens I've collected up in this area, are those ones that have come, populations that have spread from the central area of Chile southwards or northwards from Punta Arenas. Another thing I'm interested in is the consequences for the community, and here is one great example. So nectar robbing, going back to like long versus short proboscis, nectar robbing occurs when a pollinator pollinates or forages illegitimately. So, for example, on Fuchsia magallanica, you can see these holes that are gnawed into the corolla so that the bumblebee can get straight to the nectar. And this happens because it's a very long tube. And so Bombus dalbomai, which is co-evolved with this system, has a proboscis that's long so that it can reach all the way up to where the nectar is. And so it will come in kind of, from below normally and be able to collect the pollen while it's looking for the reward. Bombus terrestris, which is a short-tongued species, and other short-tongued species have special dentition that they've evolved on their mandibles that allows them to nectar rob. And so the very interesting thing, though, is that it's a socially transmissible behavior. Bumblebees and bees generally, and most of Hymenoptera, are very smart and capable of learning new behavior, forming associations with different scent cues. But what happens is that in the presence of Bombus terrestris, Bombus dalbomai will also forage illegitimately. And so what the consequences are for the fruit set of Fuchsia and how that eroded mutualism might play out in the system is not well. There's a lot of hypotheses around that. And when I get back to Punta Arenas, I'm going back down to that area down here to be able to collect more data on that and some observations and look at that. People who've already worked up, there's one paper from Chiloé, and two papers from kind of that Chiloé region that have looked at this and documented that it's occurring there as well. There's a guy over who did a research internship over in Argentina who also has some data that it's happening there as well. The other interesting thing is that the yellow jacket is getting involved. At the time when I made these observations last April, I could not determine if yellow jacket is also a primary nectar robber or if it's a secondary nectar robber like dalbomai, just taking advantage of the holes that are there. Variance in this behavior is also interesting. Yeah. So this is a video from the end of the season. So assumedly these are well-matured foragers who are they're not young. They've already learned how to deal with flowers. And so the interesting thing is that how they approach flowers varied between individuals. So if the videos work, I'll be able to show you, but some of the dalbomai would go directly for the holes. So they knew that to look for the hole first and to go and suck the nectar through that. Other individuals, though, decided or had kind of were foraging, trying to forage legitimately first. So they would go underneath and try to get the nectar through the bottom, and then they would go up. So what this video is supposed to show is that he, or she rather, goes up and then checks for a hole, and then goes to the next flower and repeats that. Whereas other individuals would just look for they knew, or they had broken completely the mutualistic behavior, and we're just going straight for nectar robbing. The other thing I'm interested in it is why Bombus terrestris has been so successful. And there's a couple different reasons why this might be. For example, phenology, which refers to just kind of like the times of year that plants are flowering or that the bees are active. So Bombus terrestris definitely has a longer period of activity during the year. So it emerges from hibernation earlier. There's some results from some other countries that compared to the native bumblebees in those areas, it also emerges with higher fat stores, so it already is healthier when it comes out of hibernation. This also plays into how there's invasive ornamental plants that have been introduced as well, and those tend to be the flowers that are flowering when Bombus terrestris appears. And so this lets Bombus terrestris get kind of the best apartment on the block, as well as get like a very large population going before Bombus delbomae comes out. So that's something I've been documenting with the start of this season, is looking at when do I see what species where, as well as what flowers are flowering at what time of year. The other thing I'm interested in is genetics for both of the species. For the Bombus terrestris, hopefully I'll be able to look at the genetics of the different populations I've collected in different areas to be able to determine if that invasion front coming down from the north really reached all the way down south, or if the Bombus terrestris started out in Punta Arenas and spread out from there. An interesting complication with that is that because there's only a handful of companies from which farmers are able to import Bombus terrestris, there's, I don't know for sure, but there could be complications in terms of just the genetics that are being set up to start a population anyways, and that could be messy in terms of figuring out where populations have been spreading from. The big hypothesis, though, is that pathogens are what is affecting the native bumblebee. So there's been a little bit of work in Argentina and in Chile, but the work that's been done is based off of samples from several years ago, and the work in Chile has only focused on kind of the Chiloé area as the southernmost point. So I have hundreds of bumblebees that I'm going to be taking to the USDA ARS Pollination Center in Logan, Utah, and I'll be dissecting them, matching them up, looking at the DNA in them, and doing a bunch of work to be able to determine presence and absence of a lot of these parasites, if that transmission has occurred, if the native species has these, and looking at the genetic spread. And then also looking at pollen samples to be able to see what flowers these different bumblebees are interacting with, and be able to build from that an understanding of what potential vectors of transmission there are out there. So what flowers these two species share, and that would be like a node where the pathogen could have been spread through. Another bit that I will hopefully be able to glean some information on is how urban areas are affecting the populations and the density of populations. So one of the things that I've noticed in Punta Arenas is that there's basically no native bumblebee. But once you get a few kilometers out of the city and down towards the south, then you do start seeing the native species. So the Bombus terrestris is definitely the dominant species, but the relative abundance is not so terribly off. Cities also have a ton of ornamentals that are introduced from the Mediterranean, and those, of course, Bombus terrestris is already very good at utilizing those sources, and Bombus delbomae likely is less so. There was a great patch formed after a disturbance on Instituto de la Patagonia, which is my hosting institution, on their campus, where they had torn up a bunch of area with some construction, and there was a huge monoculture of thistles and raspberries. And for example, they're the only species that I saw over a couple months span of surveys was Bombus delbomae, or Bombus terrestris, sorry. Unfortunately, I was hoping to be able to start looking at that area again at the start of this season, but there was more construction, and this is now just like a dirt patch. But if pending further funding, it'd be really great to come back and kind of watch what the successional sequence is in that disturbance patch and what pollinators are coming in and interacting there. uh, sorry, trebles, the clover. Clover and dandelions are all over the place, and especially late in the season and early in the season when Bombus terrestris is way more dominant. The only flowers that they're really associated with, from my observations, have been these introduced invasive plants as well. Yeah, and so some of the sites I have around town are help me look at different disturbance regimes. So Parque Maria Betty is a green space in the city that has much lower disturbance from human activity, as opposed to areas along the Costanera, which are constantly seeing upkeep on roads, people walking through all the time, as well as just being a different. There's no flowers there except for the dandelions and clover. Beyond Punta Arenas, I've worked in a bunch of different areas. So, again, end of the continent here, Isla Grande, Tierra del Fuego. I've been to a bunch of different islands in the area, and then up to Puerto Natales and some work up in Chiloé, and hopefully collecting some species here now. In Tierra del Fuego, I spent just a few hours in Porvenir, but I didn't see any bombus there, but there are records of the native species kind of on that northern edge of the island. I spent time down near kind of like the edge of the Chilean portion of Tierra del Fuego in Caroquinca Park, which is a fantastic park run by Wildlife Conservation Society. I spent a week there, didn't see any bombus, but I was able to collect using water bowl traps some of the pollinators there, and so hopefully I'll be able to look at or add to the knowledge of what pollinator invertebrates there are in the area. Some other islands I went to are Isla Carlos III and Islote Rupert. Traveled with some other researchers from Instituto Patagonia who already had a boat set up to go there and were kind enough to invite me along. There's been 2 sightings in the past year of the native species on Carlos III. There's a year-long survey or whale watching in this area. And so there's always researchers from Instituto there, and they were able to collect 2 specimens for me there, but no terrestris yet. And so all these islands so far are free of invasion, and that is hopefully good as reservoirs of population for the native species. I also went down to the very southernmost permanent city in the world, in Puerto Williams, where they have the Amora Ethnobotanical Garden, and they were kind enough to host me for a week there as well. There was no bombus sighted at all, but there was presence of yellow jackets there, so I was able to collect some yellow jackets. And then I also worked up in Chiloé. This is where most of the work that's been published, the few studies that have been published, have mostly been from this area. And so I wanted to get up there and be able to collect some of the specimens from there to be able to use in my own analysis, to be able to compare better kind of what's going on. I again saw a lot of nectar robbing going on. An interesting thing about this system is that there are also solitary bees and honeybees in the area, which adds to the diversity of pollinators and also other interactors for them to be competing against. Yeah. And yeah, perfect. So I have a ton of people to thank. At my host institution, there was a ton of people who were super helpful in helping me make connections with people at the various forest services and these other field sites. The folks at Parque Ethnobotanico Amora, Parque Caroquinca, some folks who were kind enough to Skype with me and share their expertise, as well as promise me their expertise in the future when I go and work on these specimens in Utah, the Fulbright Commission, and some fantastic friends that I made down south. Yeah.
I would say let's this next
All right, so my title's changed a little bit, but it has a basic the concept is basically the same. So the proven Chilean Pacific World Connections class and state formation. And just to give like a very brief background, last time I was here I talked a little bit about the War of the Pacific and kind of why it's such a central element of the project. So just a little quick reminder, War of the Pacific happens in 1879 to 1883. Chile annexes large portions of Peru and Bolivia, making Bolivia a landlocked country. And so from basically after that war, the kind of historiography, the sociology, kind of all the literature is one of perpetual conflict between Chile and Peru, right? So what my project aims to do, at least, is kind of try to confront that narrative and show ways in which Chileans and Peruvians kind of interacted, created unions, or they created types of cooperation across the national border. So that's the kind of foundational piece of this entire thing. And so, just to kind of give a background of like what I do on a day-in-day-out basis, you just kind of, you get to the archive in the morning, 9 or 9:30, and then you sit there and you read the entire day until 5 or 5:30, and then you go back home and you kind of catalog all of your documents that you have, right? So most of my presentation will be documents that I've come across throughout this year. To give a sense, this year in Chile I've went through more or less 250 volumes of material, about a dozen newspapers, and numerous other books written kind of during the time period. So it's pretty intense. So one chapter I have is on cholera. So basically, in 1886, cholera arrives to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and it also arrives to Uruguay and to Brazil. And so as it's being transported from Buenos Aires to Mendoza, the authorities in Chile are starting to hear about it, they're starting to worry about it. And so one of the first things that the authorities in Chile do in December of 1886 is they pass this decree. And basically what this is December 4th, 1886, and it's a decree saying that they're going to block the passage from Mendoza to Chile, right? So the effort is, let's just not let anybody through the mountains so that we can kind of try to protect ourselves from cholera. Now, doing this, saying it and then actually doing it is a much different thing, right? For centuries, people have crossed the Andes there. It's hard, obviously, but people for centuries have been doing it, so this totally failed, basically. And cholera arrives in Chile by the end of December, early January, basically. And so, let's see. So what they basically start doing is the Chilean state has to look for ways of combating cholera. So what they do is, this is a letter from to the Intendencia de Valparaíso, 1886, December, and basically what it is saying here is that they are importing medicine from Callao, from Peru, in order to help combat cholera in Chile, particularly in Valparaíso and Santiago, which is the main focus of the cholera outbreak at this particular moment. And so what this, finding this for me was great, because it shows in a very real way that not only were they, having conversations, but they actually imported material to help combat cholera in Chile directly from Peru. So this is great for me. Another thing they started to do in Chile, so part of what I'm trying to show here with respect to like state formation is to show how the state is incorporating new people and new ideas into itself in Chile. So this is, as the outbreak goes along, they start to ask for different people with medical skills of some sort to come forward and help out with the situation. So this is the last portion of various pages of people, and basically the first one is like, here's a list of doctors and where they're willing to go in Chile. Here's a list of students, of medical students with 6 years of training, et cetera, et cetera. This one I thought was great. It says alumnos whose coursework has not yet been possible to averiguar.
Determine.
Yeah, so there we go. So this is great. There's a list of people who are like, yeah, I've done some things, but we're not really sure what they've actually done. But nonetheless, they're willing to help out, right? Most of them want to stay in Santiago, but some want to go to other places, San Felipe, Angol. So I thought this was a great little piece here. Again, this is another letter from the Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores in Callao, or in Lima at this point. And this is basically saying that they are sending publications. They're asking for publications to be sent from Peru to Chile, I think, or vice versa. And so this is another way that they're kind of exchanging information, exchanging knowledge across national borders to help each other out, right? And at this exact same time, right around, so this is October 12, 1887, they are also beginning, doctors in Peru are starting to organize a conference, international conference on sanitation that will take place in Lima in I think it's January 1888 until March of 1888. And they basically invite doctors from Chile, Peru obviously, Ecuador, and Bolivia to come together and develop new ways of sealing off borders, of combating contagious diseases, etc. Okay, so that ends the kind of cholera section. But the other portion that I'm really interested in is kind of the oceanic way of organizing labor and how people kind of made connections across borders at ports, but also on ships. Let's see. Okay, so what you see here, so in Valparaiso, the police were very good at what they did. And one of the things that they did a lot in Valparaiso, particularly in the beginning parts of the 20th century, is they would send police spies into labor organizing meetings. So a lot of what I looked at in the archive here were the letters that the police spies wrote to the Intendencia de Valparaiso. So this is what this is right here. So they would send a police agent in there, they would take notes on who's talking, what they're saying, who the radical people are, who's not, right? And this is like, we should be worried about this group or not be worried about this other group. So this is October 1913. This is the beginning. This is a police report on the beginning of a strike in Valparaiso that would later be called La Huelga del Mono. Nobody knows really why, but that's what they call it. Basically, what happened was the state wanted to photograph all railroad workers. And the idea was that railroad workers did not want to do this, obviously, because they thought that if they were caught organizing or something like that, they would be blacklisted. And it's one thing to be blacklisted with a name, but it's another thing to be blacklisted with a name and a photo of yourself. So they started this strike in order to combat this. Now, what interests me here is that I don't really work on railroad workers, I work on maritime folks. But it's this little piece right here where the railroad workers are talking about what they would like to do, and then they say that they would like to get other unions on board with what's happening, and they say, en especial de la gente del mar, right? So it's kind of known that the gente del mar, the marineros, the portuarios, all these people are like kind of, they're very active, they're very well organized, and that they can make the port stop, right? So if you can make the railroad stop and you can make port stop, like the whole central economic system in Chile kind of crumbles, and you can theoretically at least get what you're aiming for. Okay, so this is a nice little kind of, okay, so backing up, so that last slide was from October 1913, this is from July 1913. And what's particularly interesting here, and I haven't seen really anybody work on this before, is that this is a police report from a celebration of Peruvian independence in Valparaiso. And it's attended by a very large crowd of people, much larger than many of the protests that happened that year prior to the strike. And so for me, it kind of shows that prior to the strike, there's already this connection, this kind of respect for Peruvians and for kind of Peruvian national identity in Valparaiso by working class people. We have to wear gloves in the archive. This is another police report. So this is the Sección de Seguridad reporting. And what I think is really fantastic here is the second piece here, right? So they're reporting on these reuniones that happened, telling, particularly gente de mar, jornaleros. Is this last little section here where they mention this guy named Otazu. Otazu was a Peruvian anarchist from the Lima Callao area, and he had come to Chile with a bunch of other Peruvian workers as a kind of state-sponsored, in a sense, way of fomenting better relationships, right? But when most of the Peruvian workers had landed into Chile, the Chilean workers were like, no, these guys they're paid off by the state. We don't want to have anything to do with them. This is the only guy who was kind of like, no, I don't participate in these state politics. I'm an anarchist, and what's more interesting to him at this particular point was to join in with some of these strikes. It was joining with some of this working class movement. So here they're kind of suggesting that he's actually the person organizing the entire strike in Valparaiso. I think that's totally false. There's a huge, long history in Valparaiso of organizing, but by doing this, they're able to kind of say, this strike is not native-born, this strike is actually foreign agitators doing all of the work. And soon thereafter, he would be detained, they put him on a boat, and they deported him back to Peru. This is a flyer that I found in the archive of the strike. I think this is just great because it kind of shows the militancy of some of these workers at this particular point, right? Particularly for those who don't join in on the strike, right? Hay que por lo menos dejarles una marquita para que se acuerden que son traidores for not joining in the strike, right? It's very clear this is a very militant situation here. And from what I've seen, so this is again police spies or police walking the streets, kind of taking flyers from people and then reporting it back to the Intendencia. Okay, so this is jumping forward a little bit. This is the 1920s. Basically, so there's this in Chile in 1907. There's a founding of this thing called the Oficina del Trabajo or the Dirección del Trabajo, and what they basically do was they were trying to figure out how working class people or poor people in general were living, what the living conditions were, how much they were making, etc. Right? And so in the 20s, in 24, there's a series of social laws that kind of get passed. And in these social laws, there's one in particular called the law of obligatory social security, essentially, which required that working class people give 2% of their pay towards this future social security thing. Anarchists, particularly the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, were adamantly opposed to this because they saw it as the state taking their own money that they had earned and was actually just making them more poor in the long run. And this is important because, so this is one of the letters from the Dirección del Trabajo, and they estimate that at least 70% of the port, of the workers in the port, are members of this group. So they're having a really difficult time trying to make these people give their hard-earned money to the state. And what the Wobblies would do is basically the Dirección del Trabajo would send a representative to a meeting, and they would talk. Okay, workers, this is the new laws. This is what we're doing, etc., etc. And the Wobblies would show up, and they would ask tough questions. They would slow the meetings down, and then when the state representative would leave, they would call a meeting of themselves with the workers and say, "This whole law is garbage, and we're not going to participate in it." So this is a letter from the Dirección del Trabajo, kind of complaining like, "We can't have a single meeting without these guys showing up. It's terrible." Okay. So this is important because at the exact same time this is happening here in the port city of Mollendo, which is, so this is Peru, right? Ending here more or less. But so right here in the province of Arequipa is the main port of Mollendo, and there's a ton of labor organizations happening in the late 1910s and the 1920s. And so unfortunately in the archive in Peru, you cannot take pictures of anything, so I just have hundreds of pages of transcribed notes. So I have this map instead. But basically, one of the things that's happening here is that there are people from Valparaiso and other ports of Chile arriving to Mollendo because it's the kind of key port going north. And they're spreading ideas, they're organizing strikes together, they're refusing to cross picket lines, and you see in a very real sense how they actually are organizing across national borders. And this is particularly concerning for the authorities in Mollendo and in Arequipa and in Callao, which would be up here somewhere, talking about how they can't believe that these kinds of relationships are actually happening, right? And there's all these really great police reports about port workers meeting in sketchy buildings at night to kind of converse about politics. Okay, so this is the somewhat more speculative chapter that I've begun thus far. So specifically sexualities, male, sex, and masculinity. So these are two different things here. So in Chile, in the archive here, they have a great database of criminal cases. This is a criminal case from Iquique in 1883, so just at the very tail end of the War of the Pacific. It's the case of an English person, a British guy from British descent, named Thomas Jones, and he is arrested for sodomy. He is, the way that the story goes is he's on the beach somewhere, he's having sex with actually a juvenile. They say he's about 10 or 11, they're not really sure, and they take him in, and this is part of his testimony. So what's really interesting to me here in this testimony is that right about here, he says something to the effect of, at this particular point, he's working as a peon, but he says prior to this, he spent many years working on ships. And he says, within ship life, male sex is totally normal. It's just what we do, right? So he's like, I may not have done what you think I did right now on this beach, but I've definitely done that in the past. And so that's, for me, it's kind of interesting, right? Because it sets this kind of stage of men having sex with other men. This is a quote from Manuel Rojas' Lanchas en la Bahía, originally published in 1932. He's Argentine, originally born in Buenos Aires, but lives most of his life in Chile and travels around the world in ships, etc. And this is a really great little snippet of two maritime workers talking about, if you're tired, you can come to my place. I have this mattress that I bought because I thought I was going to have a wife at some point. Didn't work out. But, right, nos acostamos en silencio como vientos suaves, como si... Yeah, so you get this sense, right, of them sleeping together in this mattress. And the thing that's really interesting to me is that in a lot of other sodomy cases that I've read, men are always talking about that. Either they were drunk with their friend and they got to the mattress and then laid down, they turned the lights off, and then somebody started moving, and then there it went, right? So it's a very similar thing, right? I mean, Manuel Rojas spent a lot of time in ships, and he doesn't, in this scenario here, the two men wake up the next day and are working before dawn. But I think there's something suggestive here. And so, so how does these cases of suggestion and actual, sodomy on the sea, relate to this entire project? It's this wonderful letter from 1910 from the Consulado General de Chile in Panama. So it's November 1910. It is him complaining that Chilean ships arriving to Panama, that there are tons of men having sex on these things, right? It's like, this is getting out of hand. And what's particularly important here is that he says, not only is this happening, but it's the Peruvians' fault. He says, while we occupied Lima during the War of the Pacific, Limeños taught Chilean men how to have sex with other men. And he goes to this 1894 dictionary from Spain, which has a definition for maricón. And in this definition, it's very specific that it's about men from Lima. So there's this fear that basically Peruvian men are kind of degrading the Chilean race, and particularly men, by teaching them to have sex. And this all goes back to the War of the Pacific. So it's a little, I'm not sure how much I'm going to be able to do with this, because it's obviously not something that a lot of men were writing about at a particular time, but I think that it's really suggestive of other ways in which Peruvians and Chileans were forming relationships outside of just unions, right?
Too spicy.
And I think that's it. Yes.
So, I'm actually interested in kind of this rereading of history that you're doing, and I'm wondering how this affects how you understand Chilean-Peruvian relations today, or more recent history.
Yeah. I mean, was it about a year and a half or 2 years ago? Chile and Peru renegotiated their maritime border at the Hague. I think. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's conflictual, right? Because there are still real elements of conflict between the two countries, and that's something we can't deny, right? I mean, when I was in Lima and Chile was playing Brazil, I think in the World Cup at the time, a couple years ago, I was in a mall with large screens, and every goal Brazil scored, it was as though the Peruvian team had scored, right? And I think the exact opposite would happen here, right? But at the same time, I think by being in both Peru and in Chile and talking to people, folks that I've met, at least historians or sociologists, are very much interested in trying to rewrite this. I think with this new generation of people, hopefully will come out with more complicated.
Do you think that the sort of, even if not that expansive discoveries made about the sort of sexuality of the naval workers, and especially, I mean, do you think there's sort of sort of and I wonder, especially around naval workers who are considered to be the most masculine and proud sort of points of pride for Chilean. Do you think this could sort of undermine culturally the role of not necessarily men in society, but the role of masculinity?
I mean, if my work can undermine masculinity in any way, shape, or form, that'd be great. But
I mean, I wonder how far you could.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not suggesting you should be like blowing doors open. But
No, I mean, I think one should blow doors open.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, I think that for me at least, this is my attempt to kind of show the ways in which masculinity and machismo in general in Chile is not just produced internally, but it's actually produced because of its connections to the larger Pacific world, right? And that if we're going to challenge on the one hand nationalism and a nationalist perspective of thinking about history in our society, then part of that is also to challenge these machismo and this kind of ways of thinking about sex, right? And so they kind of, for me at least, goes hand in hand, and also the fact that it's coming from a working class perspective as well.
Sure.
Right?
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting.
All right. Thank you so much.
When's the book dropping? Title Man over 6 years.
Amazon pre-order. I got you.
I have a bunch of rocks. We ready?
Whenever you go.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm Jackie, and I'm from North Dakota, and I'm a geologist. And yeah, I was at the University of Chile here in Santiago. I'm working with Dr. Martin Wright, who's a geochemist there. He's a professor. So, okay. So my presentation is kind of broken up into 3 parts, and those are just a couple pictures I took just for fun, to show you guys the animals that I saw. But from April to May, roughly, I did a lot of literature review, reading about the geology of Chile, the types of things that are going on, mostly subduction related and fluids. And then I also did like a photo session with pyrites, and I'll pass these around. I actually found these pyrites. So they're the biggest ones I've ever seen that I've found. I'm really excited. But pyrite is, as we'll see, is very important in hydrothermal and hydrothermal alteration and mining, and it's a really important mineral. So I did that the first couple months. And then from July to October, I really worked on my project, which, like almost everyone else here, it kind of changed a little bit due to road bumps. And I'm going to tell you guys some of my results from there. And then from October until now, I've basically been traveling around Chile, seeing some geology and helping a student with some field work in El Tatio. So I'll show you guys pictures and samples from that. So first, the pyrites that are being passed around. Pyrite is an iron sulfide mineral, FeS2. And what I did was I helped Daniele Tardani, who's the first author here. He's a he's a graduate student getting his doctorate at the University of Chile under Dr. Martin Wright. And and he's actually just finishing up right now, like really, really soon. He's going to graduate and be a doctor and everything. But right away, he was working on this paper, studying the decoupling of a couple elements and the link between the pyrite composition and fluid changes in an active geothermal system, Tawaka volcano, close to Temuco. And what I did is I took pictures of the pyrites in the SEM, the SEM, which is a scanning electron microscope like Kyle talked about. And this is kind of what rocks look like under that scanning electron microscope, which is a microscope that takes pictures with electrons. So it's pretty cool. And what happens is you can tell the different minerals apart because the electrons are brighter, the spots appear brighter when you have heavier minerals. So pyrite is heavier than the surrounding matrix. So in these pictures, it's the white, the really white spots. So I did that, and then what was really interesting is we were looking at the copper-arsenic decoupling, and I did catch some arsenic in some of the pyrite samples. So that was pretty cool. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Oh. Okay, yeah. And so what his work finally showed, this is just a snapshot, which is kind of cool, just to show kind of how minerals can be used in how the mining and how the fluid composition is changing in systems. So here's the pyrite grain. And this is taken with an EMPA, which is a different type of electron microscope. And you can see that there's zones of arsenic-rich
arsenic-rich pyrite, and then separated is copper, so it's definitely a decoupling going on. So that was just kind of a cool offshoot that I did. And then my project, it was going to be more focused on the actual like chemical cycling and fluid changes within the Talwaka geothermal system using geochemical modeling, but I didn't have some water samples and compositions that I needed, and I still, because the grad student, or no, an undergrad took samples in like July, but the lab is like super backlogged, and I don't know if he even has his data yet. So I decided to go back and work with some other data that Daniele Tardani had taken in 2013 and 2012, I think. And this is on superficial waters. So my project title is kind of the geochemistry of these thermal surface waters in the southern volcanic zone of Chile, and the implications for the changes in chemistry seen throughout the region. And I tried to relate those to the structural controls that we see, like the faults, the fault systems, the rock types, that kind of thing. And right now it's being reviewed by some of the co-authors, and the principal objectives were to first understand the surface water chemistry, because in the southern volcanic zone there's been a ton of work relating like the deep processes going on, the deep waters, the deep the deep magmas, fluids circulating, and tectonics, but there hasn't been really a study on the surface manifestations, and there's a ton of them in southern Chile. So that was the first objective. And the second objective is to investigate the effects again of the structural controls. So here's the area of study. We have Nevado de Chillán, which is where Leon Will lived. And it started, that's the northernmost point, and the southernmost point is down here, kind of it's north of Osorno. So we're from roughly like 39 or 37 degrees to 41 or so. And so here's Villarica, Pucón area here, just to kind of orient, and Talwaka is here. And in this graph, the waters are the points here, the blue circles, and the squares and the pink circles are the water samples. There are 30 in total that Daniele took a few years ago. And they are classified here according to the type of thermal water that is related to their chemistry that I'll talk about in a slide or so. And they're also divided by what type of fault system they're primarily controlled by. So in this photo, we have the black lines and the black dots. Those are part of the Linguini off-key fault system, and that fault system is very related. It's a back arc subduction fault. So it's basically like a strike slip almost. So it's just moving like this, because the principal stress is like this. The subduction angle is kind of coming in like this, which is causing the rocks to kind of slide like that. And then the red are a much older fault system called the ALFS. It has a really long name, but it's much more deep. Like the Linguini, the LOFS fault system, it kind of reaches all the way from basically the mantle to the surface, because it's a very active fault system. But the ALFS is it's older, and it's very badly oriented with respect to the stress field. So it's kind of oriented exactly perpendicular. So we're going to see the implications for that on fluid chemistry in a little bit. So yeah, again, the 30 waters were divided by association of fault. So the samples with the red star next to them are associated with the red, the ALFS. And I did this dividing based on more detailed maps and other work done in the past. And then also they were divided by the chemical composition. So they were based mostly on concentrations of ions like calcium, chlorine, sulfate, stuff like that. We'll see the graph in a sec. And so this is just kind of a rundown of the different types of water. So we had the acid sulfate waters, which there were 9 of. Neutral chloride waters, there were 19, they're the most common type. And then we had 2 bicarbonate-rich waters. And you can see the acid sulfate waters are very acid, and the chloride waters are more neutral, and the bicarbonates are kind of in the middle to more basic. And the temperature also changes throughout here, so the acid sulfate waters were much higher in temperature generally. And so this graph, and I will point out different things on it as we go on, but I first want to explain what you're looking at. So each column is a certain anion or anion group or cation. And up here we have the major ions. So these are present in parts per million. They're kind of dominating the chemistry. And these ones down here at the bottom are the trace elements. So they're present in part per billion. And you can see that on the concentration here. So this is the log concentration scale. This is in parts per billion, this is in parts per million.
Can I ask a quick clarification?
Yeah.
So this is all like hot spring water?
Yes.
Those temperatures are really high. So
Yep.
they're not from like lakes?
No.
It's all hot springs?
No, this is all, from hot springs. Thermal manifestations. And the blue dots show the neutral chloride waters, the orange ones are the acid sulfate, and the 2 yellows are the bicarbonate waters. So, in the acid sulfate waters, we can see that sulfate is the dominant anion. It also is pretty high in magnesium and barium. While in the chloride, the neutral chloride waters, chloride is dominating, the dominant anion. And we also have relatively higher concentrations of the green circled elements. And then the bicarbonate waters, obviously, again, are enriched in bicarbonate anion, and they also have relatively high concentrations in cations. But I can't really say too much about it because there's only 2, but generally speaking, that's what their chemistry is. And this is a picture of, it's called a Piper diagram, and this is comparing the cations that you have and the anions that you have, and then it plots them through a matrix transform into this diamond. And this is just kind of to show that yes, okay, the waters are very different in chemistry. We have the 2 outliers here, the bicarbonates, and then clusters of the acid sulfate and neutral chloride. And then to find the link between the chemistries and the fault systems, the LOFS and the ALFS again, I wanted to just go through again kind of what are the characteristics of these fault systems so we can better understand what their potential effects could be on surface water chemistry. So the orientation relative to the principal stress in the LFS is it's preferential. It's forming because of the subduction. It's perfectly aligned. While the ALFS is severely bad. It's very bad. And this has implications for the magmas and the fluids, the magmatic fluids deep within the crust. And due to the preferential orientation, it's a very permeable pathway. You have very primitive fluids and magmas forming. Then there's also a bunch of volcanoes kind of aligned on either the ALFS or the LOFS. And so the magmas on top of the LOFS, primarily controlled by the LOFS, generally have more primitive signatures because they're better connected to the mantle. And the ALFS has more crustal contamination because the fluids kind of get trapped in a way. And the permeability, the vertical permeability, again, high in the LOFS and low in the ALFS. In this picture, which is taken from Sanchez Alfaro, just kind of shows, because he did work very similar to this in just the Villarrica volcano area. And this is kind of the model that he came up with to show how the differences in faults have affected the fluid samples within that area. So also this work was kind of to extrapolate that and see if it still fit through the whole region. And so this is it's kind of like a stress indicator, like where the principal stresses are, these 2 weird pictures. And you can see here that the stress is coming here, because the stresses are going to be the same in both pictures, because it's the same. But here we have kind of an opening going on. as the plates are sliding past, you're getting kind of an opening, which affects the magmas and fluids. And then in the ALFS, you have more of a pocket sitting deeper, which also explains the crustal contamination and lower permeability. So, some results. First, since I was only looking at a limited number of trace elements, I looked first at the conservative elements lithium, cesium, and rubidium. And these are elements that are way on the left side of the periodic table. They have a charge of +1. They're similar to sodium, which is a major element in this case, but these are the minor components. And so what you would expect to see with these elements is that they're incompatible in mineral structures, and they're leached very easily from the rock, which means if you have an acid solution and it comes in contact with a rock, these elements are going to be taken out of the rock really easily because they're incompatible, mostly. And they generally will have a strong relationship with chlorine if the water has had a fast, relatively quick upflow, if that makes sense, because chlorine also is relatively incompatible in minerals as well. And so what we saw was, first I divided the samples into water type or fault system. And so on the left side is the water type, so the blue dots are the neutral chloride. The little orange squares are the acid sulfate, and the two black diamonds are the bicarbonate waters. And we see a really strong correlation between the lithium, cesium, and rubidium and chlorine. So these are all plotted against chlorine. And I put in the R-squared values, they're pretty close to 1. And when we divide it by fault system, it's a little less clear, but there's still a very strong correlation between lithium and chlorine in the LOFS, which are the yellow dots, and the ALFS waters, which are the green dots. So it becomes a little more convoluted, but that's also because it's really hard to tell what kind of structures are controlling a system in the field, because most of the faults that are mapped are inferred. And also you saw on the map that the LOFS may be dominant throughout the whole system, but the ALFS also cuts that. So there can be signals that are mixed within it. It's a real system. There's going to be a lot of speculating. But generally speaking, when I did the R-squared values for the ALFS waters, they were below 0.65, and some had zero. They were not related at all. So this provides evidence that there is a correlation between the trace elements lithium, cesium, and rubidium and chlorine in the waters that have more of a fast, efficient upflow with more permeability, with a higher vertical permeability pathway, and that generally manifests itself in the NaCl waters. And also the conservative elements, chlorine and boron, I also looked at. And what I did with this was, again, I separated the waters between water type, the chemistry, and the structural domain that is controlling the manifestation. And I took the chlorine and boron ratio. And chlorine and boron are also both incompatible. They dissolve really easily in water. So if you have a very fast upflow, again, you're going to have high ratios. And so what we have here are the chlorine-boron ratios for the acid sulfate waters are generally low, and the NaCl waters are much higher. And we had two outliers, the yellow dots here that were at Nevada State Chillán, and I'll tell you why I think that is in a second. And then also we can see here that the ALFS waters are generally lower than the LOFS waters. And this is again a log scale. And so the sulfate waters are also almost always only one sample that wasn't associated with a volcano. And what that means is that there's been magmatic development underneath or very close by. And when a when a magma chamber is degassing, it releases a lot of boron. And so the one reason that acid sulfate waters here have a really low ratio is that they have a lot of boron and relatively low amounts of chlorine. So that's why acid sulfate waters have a low ratio. And that kind of, it also is slightly less clear, but it could be the reason that the ALFS waters are also having a low ratio, if that makes sense. And then also this graph, this diagram shows lithium, chlorine, and boron concentrations. Then the chlorine and boron are weighted because lithium is a trace element. And so you need to shift. If I didn't weight them, all the points would be on this one edge. So you can weight it to kind of see more of a clear picture. And what this is saying is that here's the initial rock ratio that you'd expect to see. This is a range for a bunch of rock types. And so if you didn't have any loss of lithium or any gain in boron or chlorine, you should be close to this point. But again, here as this arrow is showing, the samples have been enriched in either chlorine or boron. And we can see that almost all of the acid sulfate waters are clustered in the boron corner, and 2 are up here. Consequently, the 2 that were the outliers in this diagram. Yeah, so these 2 are the outliers here. And so my theory on this is that groundwater mixing can introduce a lot of chlorine to a groundwater, to a fluid. So if you have a lot of mixing with groundwater, you're going to shoot up into this chlorine part of the diagram. So my theory on that is that while these 2 points are located at the Nevada State Chian site, which is only controlled by the ALFS. It's too far north of the LOFS. And so, it's just so much complicated things with this. But the ALFS, like I said before, has a lot of crustal contamination. There's been evidence from other papers that these types of systems are very controlled by transient pulses of fluid. So you get a fracture in the rock, and it shoots up a bunch of fluid that could be enriched in boron, could be enriched in chlorine, and then add to that you have some groundwater mixing with chlorine, and so these 2 samples could be kind of a manifestation of the irregular behavior of the ALFS faults, because the RV sample here is also located very close by to these 2 samples. They're all at Nevada State Chian. So I think that in that area, it's a very complex relationship between the fluid pulses that are controlled by the structural elements, and I talk about that more in depth in my paper, but that's kind of the gist. And the neutral chloride waters, the blue squares, are kind of more spread out. And it's interesting that most of these points down here also have a slight association with the ALFS fault system. So they could be getting some of this boron released during the volcanic degassing. So to conclude, the importance of the ALFS and the ALFS and the LOFS manifests itself in the development and lack thereof of magmatic chambers, and the addition of meteoric waters also influences the chlorine boron ratios. So those 2 kind of things play out, and here I have kind of a very it's basically the summary of the 2 things that are happening with the water. So in the ALFS you have very low vertical permeability, while in the LOFS you have high vertical permeability. And in the ALFS you have the development of magmatic chambers and the subsequent degassing of those chambers, which is enriched in boron. So therefore you have a chlorine and boron ratio much lower. And there's no correlation between the elements, the lithium, cesium, rubidium, and chlorine in these waters. While in the LOFS, you have a much more efficient upflow due to the orientation of the fault, and you can have a much deeper penetration of the meteoric waters, and higher chlorine and boron ratios, and relationships between the conservative elements and chlorine. So that's kind of the gist of that. And then the next part of my presentation is more just pictures and stuff. So if you guys have any quick questions about the project.
I have a question. In super layman's terms, like what is the, like why do I care about this?
Yes.
Like what's the what is like why does it matter?
Right. This no, that's a good question. I was going to talk about that, but I forgot.
Oh, sorry.
But yeah, so these are thermal waters at the surface in the southern volcanic zone. So if we can kind of divide the waters into different groups based on their chemistry alone, and we can kind of say, oh, they're in this area, they might be related to this fault system, they may be related to the other fault system, and that means that they have certain characteristics. Like you saw, the acid waters were high in sulfate, they had high concentrations of magnesium and barium, while the other waters, the bicarbonate waters, were very rich in other cations. But then you have the neutral chloride waters, which are also very high in arsenic and boron and chlorine, and those are things you don't really want to have in your drinking water, really. And so this could have implications for drilling wells. If you know kind of the geology, they could better predict where a good source of water could be, or where another important thing is kind of knowing like what is the relationship between the surface waters and the chemistry of the waters beneath, and the formation of potential ore deposits and mineral resources. And
so, living at Nevada Station, we drink like spring water directly from the mountain, basically. Do you think that was like really high in these bad minerals?
It could have been. They only really. I'm guessing they run tests on the water you guys drink. These were from.
No.
You just went.
Like literally.
What? Like out on the trip?
It could. I don't remember exactly the arsenic concentrations.
You can taste these elements, can't you? Can't you taste? I thought you could.
I mean, the water tastes 1,000 times better than the water inside.
I'm sure, yeah.
It tastes like real water. But
yeah, it's
flavor of arsenic.
But
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What do you think the effects of temperature on the water coming up might affect the amount of dissolved ions in the water?
Oh yeah, it definitely affects it.
So you think that maybe like a higher magma chamber might have an effect versus a lower? You
Yeah.
were saying that there were different heights or depths, I guess.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's cool.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, I just know that a lot of people go to like the thermal waters in those areas. Does this have any like implications and like people going? Because I don't know.
I think it's
because you
okay.
absorb things through your skin. So if you're absorbing these like metals through these thermal waters, that's not necessarily.
Yeah, and we have to also remember that this is like parts per billion. These are still low concentrations. So drinking it is pretty bad still. But like, just if you get in and get out for a little bit in the pool, it's not. I don't think it'll affect that much because it's still pretty low concentrations, but it just is not good to drink.
Rethink your hot spring visit.
But yeah, so that was the project part, and then I did some field work and some trips. I did one to the Los Pelambres mine, which is there, La Serena, and El Tato. And so first, the Los Pelambres mine is one of the largest copper mines in the world, and it's located right kind of on the edge between Chile and Argentina. And we went there as part of I got to tag along on a group trip to visit the mine. So this is a picture of the mine. It's huge. It's just massive. And they mine copper there, and there's me. You have to be really safe in these environments, obviously. And here's some pictures of the core. So this is kind of what they look like when they take core samples to kind of assess, okay, what kind of minerals are we going to find? How much of them are we going to find? And the minerals they exploit for copper are chalcopyrite, which is this pretty, it's similar to pyrite, but it has copper. And molybdenite, which is, it's a very small amount there, but it's a really shiny metallic mineral. And then the economic geology trip that I went on, we visited 4 mines, and the first was Los Bronces. These are all close to La Serena. And this is a IOA deposit, an iron oxide apatite deposit. And that picture is just kind of that's how they mine it. It was it's where fluids kind of interacted, and yeah, it's magnetic, so I brought a magnet. And this is the sample from there. The black mineral is magnetite. The green mineral is actinolite. There's some white that is apatite, and
Apatite.
and the little like bronzy looking minerals are the copper minerals. So, and this is a view inside the mine, so they can literally just extract rock from inside. And this is a picture of how the deposit formed. It was, if you can imagine a huge rock, volcanic rock, that has been fractured by fluids, and the fluids brought with a bunch of stuff. And then they deposit magnetite and actinolite in the veins. So this is kind of a cool picture. It was too big of a sample that I don't want to carry back, so I don't have this one, but that's kind of how it forms. And then you get zones further away from the actual site of mineralization that are called, this is called a stockwork, and this is finer veins. So it's farther away from the actual upflow of fluids, so you get smaller veins of magnetite. And the second one was Talcuna. This is a manto type, so it's stratabound, so this is in sedimentary rocks. And they mine copper and silver. And it's all below this techo rojo, they called it. And it's an impermeable layer that just basically trapped the fluids that were flowing up that were rich in copper. And so they only look for mineral below this certain formation. And what we did is we did a hike up this mountain that the picture is from, but there was no mineralization in this part. They're exploiting the ore that's further down the valley. And this is a picture of the techo rojo. I don't think I have a sample. Oh wait, yeah, I do. They mine bornite, and that's a copper mineral. It's a really pretty blue mineral, so you can find it in those 2 samples. And the third one was Panosillo, which is a skarn deposit. I've never been to a skarn deposit. It was really, really cool. And they form when you have basically volcanic sedimentary layers like limestones. You have to have limestone with this one. And a huge igneous intrusion comes in, and it's contact metamorphism. So you have this huge igneous complex that is hot and has a lot of, it's kind of cooling as it's being emplaced, and then it comes in contact with these limestones and the sedimentary rock, and it changes the chemistry due to the intense heat and pressure. So at this deposit, we saw a lot of chalcopyrite, and this is where my pyrites were from too. And this sample, you get garnet. So garnet, I think it's a gem mineral. So it's pretty cool. And the blue mineral, these are copper minerals that have been oxidized. So they're supergene alteration, really close to the surface, the groundwater, air.
Supergene?
Yeah, that's
a cool word.
It's like very top of the deposit.
Doesn't this look like a fake?
So yeah, and what we saw here, it's another open pit mine, and these are just piles of rock. So you just walk up, and I just found all these minerals. It was really, really fun. And yeah, so this is kind of a big view. The mine is up in this area. More pictures. And then the last one was Carmen de Andacollo, which is close to the town of Andacollo. It's like right next to it. So there's kind of a dynamic going on of, oh, we're the town, don't don't blow stuff up on this day, having like a celebration or something. And this is another copper gold porphyry deposit, and the Los Pelambres was also a copper porphyry deposit. And the copper porphyry deposits are like Chile's mine. Like that's where all the big copper comes from. So those are very important for Chile. And they form by fluids, again. Everything has to do with fluids and subduction here. And so you have copper-rich fluids being emplaced and fracturing rock and depositing copper minerals. So this is, again, it's another open pit. And they call this copper porphyry mine the smallest of the biggest in Chile. And again, I didn't get samples from here because the porphyries aren't that pretty in reality. And there's me and my friends at the deposit. And then here's kind of pictures of the core again. You can see all the fractures, and the fractures are usually filled with pyrite or chalcopyrite or bornite. And this is kind of what a porphyry is. It's a rock that has huge crystals of one type of mineral. In this case, it's plagioclase with a very fine matrix. So they look kind of cool. And then finally, last week I was in El Tatio, close to San Pedro de Atacama, and I did work. I helped a postdoc student collect data for her geyser work. She's like a geophysicist who's studying kind of the dynamics of geyser formation and migration related to faults. And so I was taking GPS points at all the geysers, and this is the two ladies that I worked with. And so that was pretty fun. And this is a sample of sinter. And sinter is made of silica. And so what happens with geysers is it's hot water moving through rock underneath. And in this case, it's very silicic rock. It's very high in silica. And so it gets dissolved due to the high temperatures. And geysers occur where you have this equilibrium between pressure, temperature, and you get water boiling periodically. And so geysers don't form in many environments. They're very rare. So it's really cool to kind of study them in Chile here. The highest geyser field in the world. And it's also the third largest in the world. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. And these are just some of the people I'd like to thank, some of my co-authors, people I've worked with, my professor. Yeah.
Are you gonna be able to take these rocks back?
Do you want me? Yeah.
You can?
Yeah.
Can I plug him in?
The only problem is the weight.
Is the weight?
Yeah.
Oh, alright.
Because these are pretty dense, some of these.
Oh, wait,
I didn't, but I do have some. I bought one. I didn't see any of them. Yeah, but where it is, I've seen pictures of deposits that are huge. Yeah, I would have loved to see it. Oh, that's the garnet.
Your presentation first because the whole entire thing changes.
Yeah, tell them.
No doubt.
Gold.
That rock is like, it's gold. Have you ever seen the movie Ted? Yeah. You remember when he goes to, he goes to that guy's house and he has Lance Armstrong's cast in bronze. Like the same size that.
Oh my god. What movie is this? Ted? Yeah.
Yeah, remember?
I remember the scene, but I don't remember the movie.
Do we have the, he's like, see this is Lance Armstrong's testing USB control.
Oh, for the remote. Are you going to control it from the phone? Yeah, he's going to control it from his phone.
Well, look at technology these days.
That works. Cool. Right. I got you.
Bro, look at my.
Should I hit the lights? Is that...
So, more drastic.
Yeah. Presenting.
More of a key than that. Okay.
I think you might need... where's the input? There we go.
I don't know.
Where do you put it in my head?
I put it in your head for sure. I don't know how. I heard it at like a grocery store or something.
How long has it been you guys?
Like 2 days now.
That's a long time.
I like technology is great. Like,
I didn't know they had
Oh,
that.
you were singing last night.
Hey everyone,
That's
I'll be as quick as possible, knowing that everyone's hungry. And the appetite makes everyone hungry. So my project is called Discobres, Unearthing the Chilean Spirit from the Global Underground. The basis of my project was basically retracing the Latin American influence in underground electronic music around the world. My grant was in collaboration with MTVU, which is MTV's basically partner institution that helps to give grants to students. Particularly this grant is designed to help explore the power of music as a cultural force abroad. So, original objectives. Develop a sonic profile of Chile's electronic music culture, examining its importance in influencing the global underground. I was originally inspired by a cohort of musicians who were essentially exiled or fled Chile during the dictatorship regime and relocated in Europe, in Germany, in Spain, Switzerland, who became very influential electronic musicians. Highlight Chile as the flagship Latin American nation for electronic music, seeing that Santiago is one of the largest communities and scenes for electronic music in Latin America. Emphasize the ways in which niche music communities can forge international and transcultural ties, and rejoin Chile's underground with its musical exports by linking historical milestones with their current representations, meaning that Chile actually does have a pretty rich past in electronic music. There are some really interesting inventors from the 50s and 60s who were some of the first electronic musicians really in the world, and they were making like crazy music concrete using sampled sounds and using analog machines to basically make experimental music, some of which is very strange and cool. Of course, those things change. And my updated objectives, not to say the other ones were negated, but there's some different things that I've noticed. So really, it became more about the local scene. Instead, I kind of started with this macrocosmic idea of how electronic music function around the world based on its Latin American influence, which is impossibly difficult to pinpoint at any given moment. I mean, the world's music culture is totally diverse and comprises a variety of genres, especially electronic music. It goes super, super deep. So I thought that digging into the local scenes of Santiago and Valparaiso actually might give me a better perspective on how to engage cultures and communities like this around the world. So Discobres kind of became a platform for artists to tell their stories. And so I spent a lot more time actually just interviewing people, sitting down with them, sort of creating these profiles around the artists that are in this region, and build a larger narrative around electronic music in Latin America and other global regions outside of the music capitals in the U.S. and Europe. So start to focus on communities outside of Berlin and New York and London, where electronic music is really sort of an obvious genre, is what everyone listens to right now, but the sounds sort of become homogenous over time. And so thinking about ways to bring in other communities that have very equally strong musicians and communities, but are maybe underrepresented. What did I do? I ask myself this every day. I profiled artists, record labels, vinyl shops, and spoke to each about their music, their workflow, their life. It's just informal interviews with Chileans and Chilean European artists from various genres and communities. I would just go over to their houses or their studios. I'd take photos, just chat it out. It was really chill. And that was what was great about it, because as an artist, I was able to talk to people from a perspective that they understood without it sounding like I was trying to examine them from a cultural perspective. I think a lot of times artists feel sort of vulnerable when people give them very formal interviews. So this was like, hey, can we meet up? I just want to talk a bit about what your experiences have been here in Santiago. And then of course attending lots and lots of parties and events, being part of the audience, observing the way that people are interacting with each other or interacting with the artists on stage, which is always really interesting because it's quite subtle the way that people move throughout these spaces and venues. But you start to notice differences in the way that people drink, for example, what time they show up to the party, how many friends they come with, how engaged they are with the artists, and are they dancing, which is always a weird thing. Who's dancing? What are they wearing? Things like this are actually really indicative of the way cultures sort of put themselves together. And I did a curated DJ mix series, which I've recently started, which is like a I want it to be monthly, but I need to kind of get more traction on that, including artists from Chile, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, kind of opening up the borders a little bit to talk about Latin American electronic music in general. And of course, social media posts sharing content. So basically, I've had a variety of angles that I was exploring this, from which I was exploring this. So this is the website. Finally got it up and designed in around April. Basically, there's two sections. There's features, which are larger profilings of artists, and then there are sort of music posts, which are like the mixes. This one actually I did myself. That was a DJ mix I did, and I got to meet Cal, who is a really awesome Peruvian artist, Mika Martini, who's a great label owner and musician. I think I have about 21 posts on there now. It's growing slowly, but the Facebook page, the Twitter, the Instagram, the SoundCloud, I mean, these are kind of the basic things for making these editorial things. And also I had the Fulbright MTVU blog, which was sort of a little more generalized kind of explanation of what I was doing there, but the Discovery site is really much more thorough. A few observations about Chile's electronic music scene. This is a little photo from Nito Vinilos. It's really turning from a social music industry into a bit more of an entrepreneurial industry as the scene grows, which is the case around the world. Artists are really leveraging their abilities and their skills to really create platforms for themselves rather than it just being about building communities. People also don't want to make music for free anymore, which is good because they should, assigning more value onto what they're doing. The internet, of course, and traveling helps to break down these borders, as well as lots of international collectives. There's a collective in Mexico called NAFI. There's a Mexico I think they're from North Africa called NAN. And I know a label owner here who's trying to sort of set up a collective like this where they're based in a city and they use those, they sort of take cues from what the city does musically, but they sort of incorporate people from all over the world. So these global collectives are popping up everywhere. Again, underground parties, independent radio. There is still a DIY culture here that's very big. People, kind of enable themselves rather than waiting for other people to give them money and do things. Everything not indie, however, if you go to a venue here, you'll notice that there are brands slathered on every surface. And so, it's sort of problematic because when an artist is playing, you take photos of them at a venue, you have Bacardi written behind them or Mistral written behind them in massive letters. And so there's always a relationship between the artists and, unfortunately, the amount of money that the venue is making for having them. So that does segment things a little bit. However, there is obviously more and more space for innovation. There's lots of new galleries and museums popping up. Alternative culture is still very strong here in Chile, as I'm sure if you've walked around the scene, people are not afraid to express themselves, so that's really important. So these are a couple of the artists. Mika Martini is the inside of Nito Vinilos, which is a really great vinyl shop. Renata from Auraki. Lars, who is actually Danish, but he runs a Chilean net label called Clang. This is Iñaki Munoz, who was playing at an expo at the Centro Cultural de España. This was from the Picnic Electronique and Parque de las Esculturas. And one of my musical heroes, Ricardo Villalobos, playing at that park. I got to be backstage for that. It was really cool. Modular Machines, White Sample has this crazy setup, which each of these little things are modules that make different sounds and modifies them. He travels the world taking his rig with him, which is really cool. It's portable. It's like a little suitcase, and you can travel around. So these are like little moments that I thought were really nice photographically. A+ playing at that expo as well. So a couple of the challenges for artists right now. The number and quality of performance spaces in the low pay for DJs and performers. Again, market segmentation by the corporations, high manufacturing and shipping costs because everything that crosses the Andean Cordillera is taxed very highly, especially books and especially vinyls, so cultural items are taxed very highly. Instruments and gear are subsequently very expensive, and I find it, I've had a couple conversations, I've had a lot of conversations about this, but it is a point of contention for some people, but I say that it's difficult to trace a musical history from traditional sounds to contemporary music, and by that I don't mean that. And I had a conversation at the University of Valparaiso last week about this, and these are the people. That's kind of, it can be taken offensively, and I didn't mean it to be that way. But the thing is that during the dictatorship, it was very much, a lot of the traditional culture was essentially erased from Chile's textbooks, and so they were kind of restarting at the beginning of the late 90s and early 2000s, especially with electronic music. So it's difficult to hear sounds that were originally from Chile, kind of from a traditional standpoint, or folkloric sounds, and how they're incorporated into electronic music now. Although now people are beginning to find those things historically and dig them up and put them back into their music. Obviously things like cumbia, electro cumbia from the early 2000s is really strange and cool. And there's lots of incorporations, but in kind of in a more modern sense, you don't listen to something and say like, oh, this is particularly Chilean electronic music, but there are a lot of great artists that are here making electronic music. So opportunities, the artists are optimistic, the audiences are passionate, the music industry is democratized, everyone likes to, be able to share their music with their fellow musicians. Artists are participating a lot in international music tech events like Mu Tech Montreal, Sonar Barcelona. There's actually a new vinyl press, the first in Chile in quite a long time. They're about to start operating in a couple months. I met them last week. And a lot more influential women and LGBTQ artists, which are pushing a lot of the social conventions of the electronic music scene, which has largely been male dominated by these, kind of macho DJ guys who really take over the stage. And, the audiences aren't always completely open to female DJs, for example, and that's changing a lot now too. Play some music for you. This is a techno house artist with a kind of experimental. Is a local record label as well. This is Ahora Aquí. So Renata actually basically scat sings. She's kind of invented her own language. So none of these things are real words. And Daniel Jeffs is actually a really famous electronic artist from Chile who, super low-key guy, but he helped start the minimal electronic music movement here, so it's interesting. Mix of minimal techno and strange jazz singing. So that's pretty cool. Next is Egg Loop, who has a bunch of records released on a cassette tape label called No Problema Tapes. And he does his entire thing with this little tiny Roland SP404, which I think is fascinating. It's all sampled from old 80s records and stuff. And it is with 3 Gs. That's not So this is Liz. She is a rapper, DJ, super cool. And she's basically right now bringing in these sounds of Atlanta trap music, mixing them with reggaeton, and then, which is huge in Chile right now. If you haven't heard reggaeton here, then you've not left your home. So she's kind of combining these worlds, and she's a really interesting artist. She's got this fashion thing going on. It's cool.
El cemento, la vida pasa lento, el aliento se me seca, yo no creo en la grandeza, la envidia no me pesa, y si mi historia entera deja que hable mi silencio, el ruido se lo lleva el viento, lo sublime y lo siniestro de estar siempre al acento, en el hoyo del cinismo, bla bla bla, cero finismo, me declaro en funeral y empiezo a sudar, 24/7 puede soportar la vida consciente de la ciudad, no quiero tener que crucificar a quienes conocí, quise ayudar, y poco inteligente soy cuchillar.
Electronic hip-hop thing, which I think is really cool. Their parties are the best. That scene of people despite the techno, and they're all kind of stiff, but they party really hard, and it's a good time. Well, you know, the audiences are much more passionate about the music they're listening to, and everyone has a really good time. This is a strange, obscure record I found by a girl named Florencia Lira, and she's now making more acoustic work, but I found this album from 2004. Some ambient, down-tempo electronica. The cool thing about this project was I basically just looked for music that I liked in Santiago and contacted the artist directly and said, hey, let's talk, you know? And so, you know, I was able to do this for 9 months, essentially, meeting a variety of artists and filtering the music based on my personal taste, but also having a open world view about it. So that was cool. I made a little video of B-roll footage that I sort of compiled during each of the photo sessions that I did. It's not that long, but check it out. Just from a few of the events that are happening. Video recap, I suppose. Not much, a couple left. So last sort of reflections and ideas moving in is Santiago's independent electronic music scene is certainly on its way back up, making a comeback from the early 2000s boom, which is where you saw some of those older guys from that video are actually people that live in Europe now, but they come back to Chile during the summer to DJ and, you know, see their families and whatnot. But the local scene is definitely growing with a lot of the younger artists. And whereas some of the older artists that stayed behind in Chile during that time have a bit more cynical view of the industry and its ability to help them, you know, get their work out, the younger artists are much more empowered, I think, seeing that they were able to use the internet to share their music. Again, the global collectives around the world are growing. There's lots of interest in Latin America's electronic music scene. Festivals are popping up everywhere. There's a new electronic music festival in Cuba, actually, that's really cool. So this part of the world has a lot more attention on it than it. I mean, Cuba's way far away from Santiago, but the Latin American scene is quite large. And despite the corporate influence, artists are leveraging brands and businesses in their favor. Liz, for example, she models for Puma occasionally, but they let her basically do all of her own makeup and style. And so, you know, they have relationships with these brands that are really cool and open. And ideas for the future for Discobres. Hire city editors in other cities around Latin America, Buenos Aires, Lima, Mexico City, Montevideo, where I know people in each of these cities that have a pretty good view of what's going on, and hopefully they'll write for me. Press and event partnerships with people like Mutech and Unsound and Sonar, these global electronic music festivals, and hopefully, you know, be able to, you know, start bringing some of these artists that I've met here from Chile back to New York to perform, and maybe do like, you know, an exchange, or we can send artists from New York down here to play. You know, if we can find funding for that, I think it's out there. You know, there's some funding for arts like that, especially with the music tech relationship. So I have to say thank you to Fulbright program and MTVU for basically letting me listen to music for 9 months and write about it. Cristian Lopez, who was my advisor at Universidad de Valparaiso, he always made me really great coffee when I went over there, which is hard to come by. And Mika Martini, Jessica Alisu Campos, who introduced me to a ton of people before I even came to Chile. Pablo Salas, Maximo Campos, guys that run labels and radio shows. They featured me on their radio show, Campo Electrico. Francisco, the owner of Nilo Vinilos, Marco Latrac, Emily McClone, who introduced me to a ton of people, and basically all the artists and everyone I met here who were incredibly nice and helpful and lovely people. So thanks, that's my project. Any questions? Ideas? I can share some tracks with you.
I want to know, like, because you were before living in New York, so like living and moving around in the scene here versus New York, like what are the major differences that you noticed are?
New York just has like a lot more venues and it's much more organized, I'd say. There are a lot of underground parties in New York, but everything, I mean, it's a bigger city, so it's just, there's a lot more going on, I'd say, in New York, but it's not, there's equal quality though, so just things are a little bit more compact. What you have here is like tiny little collectives that throw big parties like once every month or so, and they're really, like a lot of label collaborations to try to get more people to come to these events. So every weekend you'll have like 3 big parties, like every night there'll be like 1 or 2 things to do. So I think once you have more venues that start to cater to electronic music, I think it's still stigmatized a bit to be like, scenes, the drug scene and stuff like that. But it's really not like that. I mean, people are going to do whatever they do at a party, but at the same time, these spaces are totally safe, and people are just going out to listen to music. So, but comparatively, I'd say New York is a much more global center. Of course, it's easier to get to, it's cheaper to get to. People pass through all the time. So, being on the other side of the world here, I think that over time, more and more artists will start coming through Santiago to perform. And for example, I saw a New York artist, Julia Holter, a few weeks ago, and she's never played down here, but for the first time. So people are starting to come to Santiago because when the audience wants it, people come to play for them. So it's cool. It's nice to see it growing. I think in like the next couple years, things are really going to start to pick up in an awesome way. So yeah, and Lima's cool too. Lima is kind of another scene that's got a little grungier, but it's cool.
Did you ever get to DJ for a club?
I didn't DJ. I didn't. So I tried not to leverage my own artistry here. I was trying to keep these projects separate because a lot of times when people come down to Santiago and like there are some label owners, they were like, oh, I want to get a record out, and et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't want to go on to people. And it's one thing is like, oh, I'm an artist too. Like they want to hear my music. It's I didn't want it to be about me.
Mm-hmm.
I would in the future. I'd be happy to DJ. But I tried to just, I made a lot of music while I was here, for sure. But I kind of kept the DJing thing out of it. I didn't want to like promote myself and stuff like that. It gets a little complicated. But it would be a fun city to DJ in. The parties start at like, midnight and go to like 8. So, good time. So, cool. Thank you guys.